Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Atom, what its current strength might mean, and what some of our models here at the channel are making of that current strength. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. But a lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there. So if you've been following Atom recently over the last couple of months, it's been quite impressive. Atom has been one of the stronger performing assets coming out of the lows, and it's really one of the few that hasn't taken a dive recently. Its price is still up right around this local resistance up here, not giving up its gains like a lot of other assets have been doing. Bitcoin's back down, retesting the 19-20K level. Atom has not given up its gains from, the lows that it put in back in June. And in fact, we're all the way up about 126% or so from those lows as we speak. So a nice move to the upside. And as I mentioned, this is better than a lot of other crypto assets have done coming out of those local lows. And especially in this current weakness the crypto market's been showing, Atom's been holding up quite well. So what might this overperformance mean? Can we expect this to continue, or is Atom also likely finding a local top here? And what might this mean kind of going forward in a more macro sense? So to start talking about these questions, I want to talk about some of our indicators, our models that we have here on the channel. So what I'm showing you right here is the upside downside potential indicator, or UDPI, applied to Atom. So this is the long-term version, cares what moves that play out over months, so more macro in its focus. And the UDPI does a good job of quantifying high risks times for an asset. So higher levels mean higher risk, and also lower risk points. Imagine acquiring here, distributing here, acquiring here, distributing here, acquiring here, and then potentially, distributing up here. That's the idea of the UDPI. It lets you identify points at which the top is likely closer, or at least the upside potential is getting exhausted, and also points where the downside potential is likely getting exhausted. And the model's done quite a good job of this over time. And we can see this also if we just look at the raw output of the model across time. So the yellow here is the Atom price across time, and the white line here is the UDPI level across time. And you can see that right now, back in June, we were down at kind of the lowest risk levels that we've seen, ever since really the lows from March 2020. And now we've actually gone up and realized quite a bit of upside potential, up over 100%. The long-term UDPI is reflecting that. It means it's also pricing in more possible moves down, right? As Atom's been realizing upside potential, and this has been moving up, that means the downside potential is also getting built in. The fact that this is moving up means the model thinks that Atom's realizing upside potential, and that there now exists more room below, which didn't seem as likely back over here, for example. So when we look at this, we're kind of at a neutral point right now, right? We're a bit above zero, but we're not, up in these kind of higher level risk zones that we've been in back in kind of previous topping points. So, do we have to reverse here? Not necessarily, but I still tend to believe that the rest of the crypto market remains weak. Even though Atom has been showing its ability to remain relatively strong, or, frankly, just strong, even in market weakness, I think there's only so much of that it can endure before it kind of falls victim to that same weakness. So if you see the crypto market maintain this weakness, we see Bitcoin especially fall to new lows, we see Ethereum kind of fall off, start crashing, I think Atom probably is going to go along for the ride with it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Atom has to crash, all that far, or that necessarily would even have to set in new lows. But coming off of this kind of local high here seems very reasonable coming forward. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens, of course. But this is just something that I'm looking at, that I think from this perspective, either way is possible. And so I think if the crypto markets get some tailwinds behind them, some bullish action, bullish sentiment re-entering, I think then Atom actually could potentially break out of this kind of zone here and start pushing back to the upside. If instead we see just more continued weakness, I think it becomes increasingly likely that this downside comes more into play than the upside. Obviously not financial advice, it's just my opinion, but that's just something that I'm looking at kind of as a more short-term outlook for Atom. And if we look at the short-term UDPI, speaking of short-term, this also can give us some useful insights. This is the short-term version of the model that cares about moves that play out over days to weeks, so much shorter in its time preference. And you can see it does, again, a good job of quantifying risk at different points, but you'll also notice it's more volatile, given that it picks up more on these local moves than the long-term UDPI does. But again, we're coming off of an extremely low reading back here in June, and we've moved all the way up. Now, what's interesting is we're actually getting a divergence here. You'll see that prices continue to move up, but the short-term UDPI has actually started to move down. And so that actually might mean is that the model thinks that there's increasing upside potential now, even as price has gone up relative to the downside. So obviously there still is quite a bit of downside that still exists, but there is this bullish divergence. And that's where, again, unless the crypto market really kind of continues weakness, it could be that all else being equal, at least from the short-term UDPI's perspective, upside might in the short term be possible. So kind of my overall read between these two is I think the long-term UDPI is a little bit undecided, and that's where I think what the crypto market does will decide which way this ends up blowing. And I think still with the short-term UDPI is probably going to be the case. If there's a lot of prevailing weakness, then even with this kind of, you might consider a bullish divergence here, that might still not end up meaning anything and price could roll over. But if things kind of remain either neutral or if we get some bullish sentiment in the market, I think then we could potentially see price continue to move up from here in the short term. This is a very interesting pattern that doesn't play out all that often, or it's not a super common pattern to see these price moving up and risk moving down. Really what that suggests is that the model thinks that there's increasing upside potential relative to downside and is building that in to its risk estimate. So it's something to keep an eye on for sure. But again, I don't think that Atom's going to operate in a vacuum. I think it will ultimately depend a little bit on what the rest of the market does. And even with this divergent forming, I think this very likely could be a short-term top if weakness in the crypto market remains. Yet to be seen. That's kind of my overall reading of those data right now. Now, if we flip over to a final model I want to talk about here, the momentum biased indicator, this gives us also some interesting information from a more macro perspective. So if you're not familiar with the MBI, it quantifies momentum in an asset, and specifically it's the momentum bias indicator. The idea is that it's trying to identify when the momentum is biased to the upside, which tends to happen in bull markets, or when it's kind of biased overall to the downside, which it tends to happen in bear markets. So kind of bullish momentum pulling price up, bearish momentum pulling price down. And what you'll see is that we actually printed our lowest MBI readings ever, back in these two big capitulations that we saw here. Although interestingly, you actually see a slight kind of bullish divergence that formed between this one and this one, right? Where we got a higher low here, even though price went to a new low, and then we actually ended up shooting off to the upside. Kind of an interesting thing that played out there. Now we've actually reestablished a positive momentum bias in this move. And what's notable about that is this is, of course, the first step, the first thing you need to do before you can start transitioning into a next bull market. You can see it back over in these other bearish times. You get down to negative momentum bias. Oftentimes you'll see this kind of oscillation around zero, and then you might see a big, more explosive move to the upside. Kind of oscillations, explosive to the upside. And so what we're seeing is actually a decent amount of time getting spent above zero, which is notable because what you don't want to see in a bear market is this kind of behavior playing out where you just poke your head above zero and then go back into the red, poke your head above zero, go back into the red. That's very diagnostic of bear markets. We see this in basically every asset I've looked at the MBI for. This is the way that they'll behave during bear markets. You get these relief rallies, poke your head above zero, but then just go right back down into a negative momentum bias regime. It's notable we're spending considerable time up here so far. And that's one of the possible benefits of this relative strength is that we're actually starting to build in more positive momentum bias. And so even if we do have to roll over from here, what we might start seeing is this type of behavior, which tends to happen, again, in these transitions between bearish times in the market and bullish times in the market. Now, of course, this all has to be, the caveat with all of this is that, Adam, as I mentioned before, I don't expect it to operate in a vacuum. So if there's suddenly massive weakness in the crypto markets, or if the stock market crashes, which causes a crypto crash, even with Adam trying to reestablish positive momentum bias, I don't think that's going to save it from those broader conditions. But again, if broader conditions kind of stay neutral, or if we've seen kind of the worst of the bear market at this point, this could be a very plausible point for us to start building into a new kind of more bullish disposition from this model's perspective. And so kind of my overall reading across these different models is that I don't want to downplay the possibility of downside here, right? And in fact, I think in the short term, it's very reasonable for us to kind of have a rollover here and have to set in kind of a higher low for Atom on a higher time frame before moving back to the upside. I think that's very plausible, and I think that would be totally consistent with what these models are seeing here. There's plenty of room to the downside that's left. And of course, when you're in a bear market, kind of these levels of risk are more in play, or these levels of relative downside are more in play than these ones most often. But if we can start kind of, continuing this bullish pattern, and if we don't see a lot of market weakness, this could end up turning into something like what we've seen before, where we start oscillating around zero, maybe to come back down here in a correction, come up, back down, then up. And then we might actually see a more explosive move back to the upside. And given the strength that Atom has been putting in so far out of these local lows while everything else has remained relatively bearish, maybe Atom is one of those assets that's likely to lead the charge in the next kind of more explosive bull run across the crypto space. Who knows? It doesn't always play out, but sometimes the asset that shows the most strength in really bearish times can sometimes be the one to pay a lot of attention to, because it can be the one then that ends up performing really well in the next kind of more bullish phase in the market. That, of course, doesn't always play out. You can have assets that look like they're performing really strongly and then just completely collapse later. Ethereum actually did that at the very beginning as we started to enter this bear market, where Ethereum was not crashing or correcting nearly as heavily as Bitcoin was. But then, we all know that Ethereum went on to then collapse all the way down to less than 1,000. And so these things don't always play out, but it is certainly notable. The fact that Atom has been outperforming a lot of crypto assets in this very bearish time in the market, it's one that I'm certainly going to be watching as we go forward. And certainly if we get a more bullish footing in the market, Atom is going to be one I'm going to be watching quite closely to see how it starts behaving going out of that. And of course, continue to watch some of these indicators as well to get an idea of, if it does go on a big run, when does it start getting overextended? Or if it does start correcting to the downside, when is that correction likely to start finding a local bottom? All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter for a lot of updates about indicators and more over there.